Okay, wonderful. Welcome. This is the second class in a series on Christian ethics that we're having here more or less once a month. And the topic for tonight is a very important one for ethics. It's the topic of freedom, the nature of freedom. And perhaps the first thing to mention is we won't really get into arguments of whether or not the human being is truly free, although that's something that people debate. I have a good friend, Father Steve Brock, who's a very good philosopher, who's got a talk on this on, I think, the Thomistic Institute podcast, or one of those podcasts. And the title of the talk is Freedom an Illusion? Right? We won't go there. What I'll do is just tell you what Thomas Aquinas says, which is basically he says that if we're not free, then the whole field of morality or ethics doesn't make any sense at all. And so there's no point to moral discourse, whether exhortation, encouraging someone to be better, reward or punishment, if we can't be held responsible for our actions, at least to some degree, right, to some extent. There'd be no point to rewarding people for good behavior, praising them for good behavior, or punishing them or shaming them for bad behavior, if they weren't free and accountable. Now you might say, well, I do that to my dog and he's not free, but that's simply conditioning, right? And so if your dog, God forbid, bites someone and, really hurts them, well, you might put your dog down, but it's not like you don't think your dog is evil. You just think he was a bad dog, right? Not a bad person, right? So it's not like he knew better. He just had a lapse or something wrong with him. Whereas with people, right, we assume that there's at least some degree of responsibility for their actions. Otherwise, we wouldn't reward them or punish them and say things like, well, you should have known better, or assume that they did know what they were doing and still did something wrong, or that they used their freedom well and did something right, and then they're praised and rewarded. Okay, so there is freedom. So the focus of our talk tonight, as the title indicates, is to talk about different dimensions or senses of the word freedom. And we can start with freedom of choice. I'm going to make 6 points, or I'll cover 6 different topics. And the first one is freedom of choice. This is the most, I think, popular sense of the word freedom. And freedom of choice is basically when we're free to choose between options of action or options of objects to select. I'm free to do this or not to do it. I'm free to do this thing with my time or to do that other thing. I'm free to obtain this material thing or this other thing, to pursue this course of action or that other one. I like to call this supermarket freedom, right? If you go to the cereal aisle, you have all sorts of options, right? You can buy Wheaties, Lucky Charms, Life, Cocoa Puffs, etc., etc., etc. What's interesting about that freedom of choice, for that supermarket example, is that the options only really exist as options of choice when you've decided previously or beforehand that some goal is worth pursuing. So before you choose between options, before you exercise your freedom of choice, you've already judged, maybe subconsciously, that something is good for you, that you want to achieve or acquire, do or enjoy something. You have some goal or end, and the options and the freedom of choice is only in play because you've got this further goal or end. So therefore, you don't just find yourself in the cereal aisle. You want cereal. And then you go and say, okay, which kind of cereal do I want? If something is absolutely necessary, there's no choice. Right? It's like, if I want to live, I have to breathe. And so I only choose not to breathe in very specific, strange circumstances. Temporary, hopefully. Right? If there's only one option, right, given that you want something, there's no freedom of choice. You wouldn't say you're not free, but there's no choice there. That mode of freedom is not lived. And so you still might eat cereal freely, even if you couldn't choose what brand of cereal you're eating, right? Now, that said, of course, if you decide not to eat breakfast, you don't even worry about what kind of cereal. You don't even go to the aisle, right? You're not gonna. Those choices don't exist for you. Now, why would you decide not to eat breakfast? Well, you might think, well, health is important. Someone told me skipping breakfast is an easy way to lose weight. Okay, why is losing weight important? Well, because these studies tell me that if I'm overweight, right, at least these risk factors, or I want to look better, or athletic performance, whatever, right? And so all of our choices are kind of embedded. Freedom of choice is always embedded, as we just saw. Right? Options here are for the sake of some further goal, right? But then that goal might be for the sake of some further goal at a higher level, right? G1 or G2 or whatever you want to say. Aristotle and Aquinas say this type of thing can't keep going forever, right? So if you get to something like health, and then you ask yourself, well, why do I want to be healthy? You don't get very far after that, because health is just constitutive of a good life as such. And so we all kind of naturally, Aristotle and Aquinas would say, we all naturally want well-being, or we want happiness. And there are certain goals that are very close to well-being or happiness, like being alive, right? Obviously, that gets complicated when you think about eternal life as Christians. So sometimes even being alive in this world is not an ultimate good for happiness, right? It has to be sacrificed for the fullness of life in the next world. Okay, martyrs and things like this. Interesting examples of freedom of choice and how it kind of maps onto life as such would be something like what high school girls or boys go through, right? What college should I go to? How do you make that choice? Well, first of all, it's based on another desire, right? I want to go to college. Somehow this is part of the good life for me. No, it might not be, right? Not everyone has to go to college. I like to tease girls. I say, why are you going to college? Just learn how to code. And you'll never, unless something really bad happens, which even if something really bad happens, college won't matter either. Right? Learn how to code and you'll never be out of a job, right? And so maybe I shouldn't tell this to a group of parents here at Montrose. I'm always trying to do things that get me fired. I don't know. Never seems to work. My boss is here. I'm getting nervous. She's not laughing. I don't know. All right, I'll see you guys later. Right, college might not be for everyone, clearly. And so the decision, okay, what kind of university do I want to go to, is based on a certain vision of life and what you're expecting out of it, right? A certain vision of well-being and flourishing in life. Who should I marry? Well, that's based on, well, I think I should get married, right? And that's a good question. Do I? What kind of life is the right one for me? And so some goals are chosen, right? So if you're choosing between colleges, right? I don't know, Boston College, Harvard, the great University of Dallas. As a goal to a college education, right? Well, some goals are chosen, right? College education versus just coding. The University of YouTube, where you can learn that. But maybe not, right? Maybe you've never reflected on it because no one's ever brought it up, and you're just in this culture where college is just a given, right? Obvious, right? So I think as we live our life, it's good for us, if we want to exercise our freedom of choice well, to make as many of these higher level background goals explicit. And that is very important for the moral life. It's like, what kind of person am I striving to be? What are my highest ideals? Right? When push comes to shove, what is my vision of a good life? In what does my happiness consist? Because once you have that, and if you're Christian, it's something like God, therefore my prayer life, my sacramental life, my love and service to others. Therefore, of course, my family relationships. I'm always trying to be a better husband or a better wife, a better parent. My work. And so, but those are kind of, two are kind of hierarchically structured, right? God is more important than anything else for a Christian. Your family is more important than anyone else besides God, right? In the Christian order of charity. And then you think about the ideals. So how do I want to be for God? How do I want to be for others? And that'll shake down into, what kind of cereal you buy. Maybe not consciously, but it affects everything. Because, why do I get out of bed in the morning? And then why do I have breakfast or not have breakfast? Well, ultimately it leads to, because I want to be this kind of person for God or for others, okay? So the more you can make that conscious as opposed to just subconscious or taken for granted, the more you can freely shape your life at the highest level and therefore also at the lowest levels. Whereas the more we don't reflect at a high level of the kind of person we want to be or what happiness consists in or what the good life consists of, well, then we get into like a more of a possibility of a bifurcated life. Because we take for granted, okay, my Christian side, this is telling me heaven is the most important and charity is the most important. But I have this other way of thinking, which is more worldly, and that's telling me that my reputation is more important, or rest is more important, or entertainment is more important, or pleasure is more important. And so you can have like undisclosed ends that are shaping your life that really don't, fit together, right? And so reflection on what are my ends, what are shaping my choices, what's really important, gives you a chance to use your freedom to kind of give you a kind of unity of life, a coherency to your life based on the truth. All right. That was a lot of words strung together. Any questions so far? So far? I didn't mean to say all that yet. It just kind of happened. Any questions so far? Great. Okay. All right. So that's freedom of choice, which is interesting because people are really into it. I need to be free, keep my options open. But they don't realize many times that their options are actually shaped by very few things at the top of the chain, right? Or at the top of the hierarchy. All right. Then we can talk about something like freedom from. So freedom of choice clearly isn't the only dimension of freedom. We can say I'm free because I'm free to choose, but we can also say I'm free, I'm acting freely because I'm not being coerced or I'm not being forced to do something. I'm doing this because I want to do it. I'm doing this on my own free volition, right? This is something voluntary. This is freedom as the voluntary, which is kind of like the core of Aristotle's analysis of freedom in the Ethics. What kinds of coercion are there? Well, there are two basic kinds. There's different forms of external coercion. So that would be something like violence, intimidation, blackmail, torture, right? Where some sort of external agent puts pressure on you to force you to act or choose or think a certain way, okay? Force you to do something that you usually wouldn't without that pressure. Then there's internal coercion, right? That could be things like our own emotions, right? Fears, insecurities, strong passions. All of those can act as a kind of limit on our freedom. And so if you act out of anger, right, in a moment of anger, well, if that passion hadn't been there, even though the circumstances be the same, you wouldn't have done it. And that's why you have remorse. It's like, oh, I'm sorry I did that. I was really mad. I shouldn't have said that, right? Or I shouldn't have punched you in the face or whatever. And so in the moment, we have the experience that we weren't really fully free because the passion or because the emotion was so strong. And then once we regain our peace, we reflect on it and we're like, oh, that was, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have chosen that. Which kind of implies that in the absence of that emotion, we would have acted differently, right? More justly or more, in a more controlled manner. And this is very important that we come to grips with this, because even these higher goals can definitely can be undermined by a lack of freedom from, right, or by too much coercion, internal coercion. So it's like, I would love to be an actor and to join the theater club, but this tremendous stage fright keeps me from it. And so unless someone says, no, I need to find a way to overcome this fright, this fear of public speaking, they might really limit their career or their leisure activities, their possibility of being an actor in the public sphere, and different, not just a stage actor, but an agent in the public sphere. Clearly, it's something like anger too. If that's not gotten under control, it can really do damage to those high ideals of what constitutes a good life: love of others, our relationships. Temperance, same thing, right? A strong passion. I really wanted to stop eating the fried chicken, but it was so good, I ate the whole bucket, right? I'm sorry. I don't know what got into me, right? And it took 10 minutes. All right. So those are some coercive elements, you could say, that limit our voluntariness. External ones, internal ones. Another one that's internal, which is very important and interesting, is ignorance. So one thing is to say, if I hadn't been so angry, I wouldn't have done that. And so I know I need to learn how to control my anger. Another thing is to say, if I knew that was illegal, right, I wouldn't have done that. Or if I knew it was immoral, right, I wouldn't have done that. And so there too, ignorance takes away some of the freedom to choose otherwise, because had you known, you would have chosen differently. And that's very important because obviously there's levels of knowledge of the moral law. And so when you look at others and say, how can they do that? Well, they might be culpable. They might know that it's wrong and do it anyway. We know that we've done that with different things. But they might not. Right? Maybe they've been raised by wolves, or the moral equivalent, right? And that happens, right? There's a lot of people who are raised with a very low threshold of morality, and perhaps their own personal experience, their passions have been shaped in a way that's vicious as opposed to virtuous. This is why education is so important. Aristotle talks about this. Basically, before you have the use of reason, you have to feel right about morality with your feelings, with your instincts, before you can think about it rightly. And what does that take? It takes someone else taking the place of your reason and saying, hey, that's bad, right? That's shameful, this is good. And so if you grow up in an environment or culture that's morally deficient or corrupt, which in many ways ours is, we have some good things too, it can be hard to get to maturity or adolescence and know how to think morally because you haven't been used to feeling morally in the right way, all right? So ignorance is another, in a sneaky way, it doesn't seem like coercion, but it does limit freedom. This is why moral virtue is so important for freedom, right? Moral virtues make us freer, especially the moral virtues that help us regulate and moderate our desires. Unless we learn how to moderate and regulate and act in the face of our fears or our anger or our passions, we're never truly free. We're always pushed around by our emotional state. And our emotional state is not something that's directly under our power. And so the point of the moral virtues, especially the internal ones, fortitude, temperance, prudence, which is thinking well about how to act, which is the relationship of action to the truth, are super important for the degree of our internal freedom, right? Freedom from disordered emotions and freedom from ignorance, okay? Otherwise, we're just, we're kind of just at the beck and call of whatever our subjective emotional state happens to be. And if you never get on top of that because you're trying to cultivate virtue, well, then you're going to be a very weak moral agent. Anytime I'm angry, I lose my peace, I lose my charity. Anytime I want to eat too much, well, that's what I do, I eat too much. Anytime I'm afraid, I run away from challenges. And even though you might have the right moral ideas, I need to act like this or like that, you're just too weak emotionally to do it. Right? Your freedom is hampered by your lack of virtue. Good. Any questions so far? All right. Freedom 4. This is a very interesting one. It kind of relates back up to this one. This basically is a question. Okay, what is our freedom for? What's the point of being free? And to cut to the chase, freedom is for pursuing true goods. All right, and so freedom 4 is clearly related to freedom of choice, but it's not just freedom of choice. Because freedom of choice kind of abstracts from the value of the ends, right? You can say, am I free to choose bad goals or good goals? You're free to choose bad goals or good goals, right? If not, no one would be bad. Do I want to be a criminal or a teacher? Well, I could say, yeah, I'd rather be a criminal than a teacher because, it's more fun. Or I'll make more money. And then once you have that goal, I want to be a criminal. Well, am I going to rob banks, or am I going to extort people, or am I going to, be a gang leader, right? So you kind of like have the same structure. I want a job. Which college do I go to? Okay, I want to be a really bad person. What's the means to that end? And so freedom of choice would exist there, but it would be totally disordered. And so this gives rise to another question: is what am I truly free for? What's the point of my freedom of choice? And basically the answer is freedom 4 is freedom to choose what is objectively and truly good. Freedom of choice and freedom from coercion exist to enable us to do good freely because we know it's good, because we want to. And so we could say that these two are kind of in service of the third one, right? That we have freedom of choice and we have freedom from any sort of coercion. Why? So that we're free to choose what is truly good. Because viewed in themselves, right, freedom of choice and freedom from coercion could also be applied to bad ends and make you a bad person, and that would be a bad thing. So you could say, "Oh, did you murder that person? Were you coerced to murder that person?" No, I totally wanted to do it, right? And so you could have freedom from all sorts of fears or, threats from the outside, and still do something that's terribly wrong. With that lack of coercion, okay? Now this gets to charity. St. Augustine has this wonderful homily on charity where it's one of his most famous quotes. He says, "Love and do what you will." Now some people, when they translate that, they think it's too open, and so they write in, "Love God and do what you will." But actually the original quote is, "Love and do what you will." Right? Love and do whatever you want. And that's a great formulation of freedom 4, right? Love, as long as you're choosing what's truly good, you're loving God and others, yourself, love, and do what you will, right? If you have the right ultimate goal, you're not going to go too far off with your means, right? Or the specific choices to get you there. This is very important in our day and age that we realize that freedom is not absolute. And so in very influential philosophies, nihilistic philosophy or relativism, there's this idea that we have to create value with our freedom. We have to create the good. That we're not just beings who see the good and then choose it freely, but we're beings that have to actually create almost ex nihilo, out of nothing, value or goodness. That's Nietzschean, right? It's very subjectivist. And I think that's just not accurate, right? Because then our freedom would become arbitrary, right? And very few people are creative. No one's really creative enough to create their own values, right? Everything's kind of borrowed in the end. So I like to think of it like this. Think of a taxi driver, right, with nowhere to go. If a taxi driver's there and he's got no customers yet, well, he's in his car, and in one sense, he's completely free. He's got total freedom of choice. He can go anywhere he wants. And he's not coerced at all, right? No one's telling him what to do. But once he has a customer, okay, his focus gets narrowed. I need to go here. And so in a certain sense, he's no longer as free. His options are limited. And in another sense, his freedom from is a little bit restricted too, because he's coerced by the demands of the other person, of the customer. But now his day is useful, right? It's got a point. It's got a purpose. It's got a goal. And so I think unless we really see freedom of choice and freedom from in the service of freedom for, we're kind of like the taxi driver before he gets the customer. And a lot of people live this way for a long time, right? People are afraid of commitment because they've seen other commitments be destroyed, or people have not, been committed to them. People like to keep their options open. But even keeping your options open, right? If you keep your options open, it means you run the risk of never being committed to a high goal, right? And never having those high standards of, I'm committed to God in a vocation. I'm committed to others in my family life. I'm committed to this profession. And so even keeping your options open actually limits your options, all right? And so that's the fourth point, right? Freedom and commitment. I always spell commitment wrong. Is that one T or two T's? One T?
One T.
Does committee have two T's?
One day.
This is the problem with our... you spend half your life without spell check, and then you spend half your life with spell check, and then you're in trouble, And so this is a problem that, if we value this too much in itself, right, our range of options, and if we misunderstand lack of coercion, we become afraid of commitment because we start to think that commitment is a kind of coercion, which it can kind of feel like or look like if you think about it, right? And so the classical example is a mother, right? Is a mother free not to feed her children? Well, technically, yes, right? She can decide, I'm tired, right? This baby eats every day. He can't take a day off eating, there's a good show on, right? Technically, yes, she's free to make that choice to say there's some thing that will make me happier than feeding this baby who's starving. And unfortunately, some people make that choice, right? There's abuse and neglect. But for a good mother, right, she doesn't really experience that as a choice, even though she's free to do the opposite. She experiences it as something she has to do. But you wouldn't say she does it under coercion. It's just part of who she is and part of what she's taken on in this vocation. And so in a way it looks like coercion, but it's really not, even though she doesn't experience it as like having another choice, right? This is the necessity of love, and love is always free. And so here we get into a little bit like conflicts of happiness, right? If we think of happiness as a feeling primarily, or as a pleasure primarily, versus the overall result of a good life, good commitments, good choices, good habits, the good use of freedom, well, then we get into this conflict between, right, freedom of choice, freedom from coercion, and the freedom for, right, the freedom of love. And that's just life. Sometimes there is going to be that conflict, right? Because it's hard to stick with commitments in marriage, at work, in a vocation, in growing in virtue, right? There are moments in which the immediate experience of it, all things considered, would not be chosen, right? Would I choose, like if I just lived in a vacuum, would I choose to feel lonely or neglected or sad or tired? No, right, in a vacuum. But your life doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It exists within this framework of commitments to people and to God, and that's who you are. And unless you see that those moments and seasons of difficulty, which you wouldn't choose if you could choose them like outside of your life, are part of your life and are leading to something good and a part of your highest ideals, well, then you're going to more and more feel this tension, right, between what you want and what you want, if that makes any sense, right? Like how you want to feel and who you want to be, right? And so you have to just be patient with those things, learn how to cope with them, learn how to alleviate them, but alleviate them in a way that's consistent with your higher goals of true freedom, right? The life you want to live, the commitments you've taken on, right? And so I think, in general, we're bad at this as a culture, and we need to be better. Okay. What else should I say about that? A great story. John Paul II. I love this story. John Paul II was once asked by a journalist, "Holy Father, what do you do with your free time?" And so you laugh, right? And so why you're probably laughing because you're thinking the typical like martyr answer, right? My free time, ha ha ha. I am the leader of billions of Catholics. I have all this responsibility. I don't have any free time, right? Is that why you laughed? Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that's a good laugh because that's one way he could have answered that question, right? Another way he could have answered that question is to kind of like pull the Renaissance man card on people. John Paul II skied, hiked mountains, did philosophy, wrote poetry. He was just an incredible guy. So he could have said, well, in my free time, I like to ski and hike mountains and write poetry. And if I'm feeling good, I do them all at the same time, But his answer was amazing, right? What he said was, all my time is free time, right? All my time is free. Because he's taken total responsibility for his life. And so even though he's got things that are put on him that, okay, if he could choose in a vacuum, he wouldn't have to deal with this person or with, the Soviet Union or with all the things that he had to, deal with. But he accepted it all, right? That this is who I am. This is the things I've taken on, or the things that God has asked me to take on, and I take responsibility for it. Right? So whether it's a good day or a bad day, something I like or I don't like, it's all free. Another great example of that is, I don't know if he really said this, but now I don't have his name. I got his name in another file. Franz. It's either Franz or Hans. That sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit. Exactly. Yeah. Woo! All right, that went downhill real fast. I'll find his name. Anyone know his name? Jagerstatter. Blessed Franz, I think. Jagerstatter. He was an Austrian. You guys don't know the story? World War II? Huh? The guy in World War II? Yeah, right, exactly. So, there was a movie made about him. It's called The Hidden Life by the famous director. Now I'm blanking on his name, too. No, the director wasn't Hans. But this guy, I think it's Franz. This is really embarrassing, Hold on. No, it's Jagerstatter. That's his last name. Franz. No, I'm not talking about the director anymore. The director did The Tree of Life. He's a famous director.
Terrence Malick.
Yeah. Malick, right. Terrence Malick, okay? He has a movie called The Hidden Life. It's about the life of this Franz Jagerstatter. Franz Jagerstatter was beatified by Benedict XVI. And his story is fascinating, right? He was a simple guy. He was a farmer. He had a wife. He had a couple daughters. It's a great movie. And he refuses to serve in the Nazi army and take a kind of oath of allegiance to Hitler. He's a conscientious objector. And so he's arrested, and even like his bishop and his parish priest said, "Look, you can do this. It's not, they're going to make you a medic. You're not going to fight for Hitler. You'll just help, right?" But he felt in his conscience, "No, I can't do this." And so, of course, he gets arrested, and eventually he gets beheaded. There's a scene in the movie where his captors are trying to get him to capitulate. They're like, "Look, it's not worth it. You can live. You'll be free. Right? If you just sign this, you'll be free." And in the movie, at least, I don't know if this happened in real life, they say, "You'll be free if you just sign this." And he says, "But I'm already free." A beautiful example, I think, of this idea of the limitation of our freedom in real life and the importance of taking responsibility for it and living our commitments. That leads us to what we call interior freedom, right? So there are situations in which your freedom of choice and even your freedom from, right, are severely limited. And so Franz Jagerstatter, he couldn't choose like what kind of cereal he would have, right? He couldn't even choose, in certain sense, he couldn't even choose whether he was going to live or die. He could just kind of accept, well, he could choose that, right? But not without violating his conscience. And so what was he free to do? He was free to accept or not interiorly his fate, right? God's plan for him. And that's called interior freedom. Viktor Frankl has this wonderful quote in Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who also was lived in the time of World War II. He ended up in the concentration camp. He was separated from his family, his wife. All of his family died in the Holocaust. But he had this reason to live, which obviously helped to keep him alive. Also God's providence, because even if you have a reason to live, they can still kill you. And his reason to live was to write his work, right? It was to write his manuscript. And his experience there kind of reaffirmed what he was already thinking about, the importance of meaning in life. And he came to the conclusion that those who found meaning or accepted some way their situation, right? The victims of the Holocaust, right? The people who are still the survivors and the people in the concentration camp. Well, they lived longer, right? Because they didn't give up hope. And so this is one of his quotes, which is very important. He says, "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Right? Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And I think that's kind of concretized or exemplified both in John Paul II's quote, right? "I'm always, all my time is free time," and in the quote from the movie, in the hidden life of Franz Jagerstatter, where he says, "I'm already free." And here it's hard because, we live in such an affluent time, and there's such an emphasis on freedom of choice and freedom from coercion, that if we're not careful, we can feel coerced without really being coerced. And this comes from a kind of immature view of life, where we never grow up and take commitment seriously or accept that suffering is a part of life, and it's a good part of life for growth and for love, even though it's suffering. And so, you grow up watching like rom-coms or, action movies, and it's like, okay, there's an adventure, but everything's laughing, and Bruce Willis always has a joke, and, after half an hour, the problems all disappear, and everyone is happy, and hee, ha, 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 and the girl's beautiful, and the guy's, goofy, but dependable somehow. And, right? And then we start to think, well, that's what life should be like. Beautiful people, great careers, fun friendships, the best relationships. Difficulties last a half an hour and then they're wrapped up. And then when we see life as it really is, well, it's like, oh my gosh, right? And so if we're not ready, and if we're not like living for the ideals that are worth suffering for, and to see those sufferings as part of our love and part of our commitment, that it's also freely accepted, well then, yeah, we get resentful, we live those things begrudgingly, we're not happy, and that's when people rebel and they bug out in different ways, right? They turn to drugs or alcohol, they try to change their situation in life. It's like, dude, you're 50. This, this is your life, I mean, I get it, it's hard, but, what are you can't just like, start over. You're not fooling anyone, right? Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so that's one problem, right? Is that because we have the wrong view of happiness, we put it too much in pleasure and in, kind of easy choices and easy solutions. We can feel coerced by circumstances even though we shouldn't. These are just things that, we have to accept and grow through. And there's all sorts of virtues you can grow in, right? Patience, learning how to be happy even though not everything's perfect. A deeper joy of knowing that we're being committed. A love of God. Right, a prayer life can exist, right? Great love of God and learning how to be happy because we're meeting God can exist in all sorts of terrible circumstances, right? The saints show us this. The Holocaust saints show us this. Edith Stein, Maximilian Kolbe. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it's great to know that we could also be truly coerced, right? Limited by grave circumstances, and still manage to be free if we want to, or if we have the wisdom to. So we can freely consent to a situation that's explicitly and essentially difficult to accept if we have enough perspective. And that kind of perspective really only comes with, I think, personally, with either a very deep sense of morality, but most of the time with a sense of the trust in God's providence. So there's some things I think you can only really live through well and with dignity and accepting with freedom if you have a sense that even though I can't see the reason for this, it's part of God's plan for me because He's letting it happen. And that's the lesson of Job. It's really, Jesus is a model for all of this. It's very beautiful. It's great to reflect on Jesus' freedom. So Jesus says things like, I only do what pleases Him. It's a great line in the Gospel of John, where the Son of God made man, true God and true man, reveals to us His motivation. Why is He doing things? To please the Father. Now, if you ask them, well, does that mean you're not free? Do you always have to do that? Right? I mean, well, it's only one thing, right? Where's the freedom of choice? Well, because He loves the Father and because that's who He is, He's the Son of God, right? He knows how good the Father is. He knows how great it is to love the Father. He knows how much the Father loves Him. It's the only thing He wants to do. And so, in a certain sense, it's a coercion because there's not a huge freedom of choice, even though He is free. I mean, He's totally free. And then He says things like, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And so even Jesus, who is the holiest and the best person ever, had a huge moment in His life where He was like, right? Any way out of this, But he reinforces it and accepts it and lives it freely because he trusts God, or he trusts the Father. He wants to love the Father. I only do what pleases him. So he says, if it's possible, let this chalice pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. All right? And then, when he describes his own passion, he says, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down on my own accord. That's very important because obviously they are taking his life from him. He's not committing suicide. Right? They come and they put chains on him and they beat him and they accuse him falsely. They're doing all these things unto him, which are extremely bad and extremely unjust and extremely terrible and objectively terrible. They're killing God. It would be bad enough if they were just killing an innocent man, right? But they're killing God. And yet, at the same time, Jesus says, this, all this bad stuff, and it's objectively bad, it's a sin, is part of God's plan for me. And therefore, no one takes my life from me, right? I lay it down on my own accord. And so that's a great example of, freedom from coercion, because he's got this tremendous interior freedom, even when he is being coerced. Right? That doesn't mean we go out and say, we kind of invite abuse, or we don't try to get out of, right? Because that's not good. We always have to live love. But we have to live love with a certain trust in God. And so if someone is hurting me, I can distance myself from them, not just for my own good, but for their good. It's bad for them to hurt me. I can try to stop them. I can try to, get justice. But interiorly, while the hurt still lasts, it's part of God's plan for you, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't happen. Nothing happens in the world, externally or internally, that is not at least permitted by God. It's not that God's doing the evil, but permitting it. And if he permits the evil to Christians and to Christ, it's because somehow it can turn to our good, right? St. Paul says that all things work into the good for those who love God. So the freest we can be, is to trust God with the things that we find the most difficult or the most coercive. Which again doesn't mean just being a pacifist and not trying to better the world and better our situation. But internally it means a kind of certain acceptance of things that we find very difficult because they're part of our life and part of our commitments and part of God's plan for us. Great, I think. Great that we're done at least, right? All's well that ends.